There are days that begin with the scent of coffee and the weight of certainty, days where every movement is a practiced dance and every word is rehearsed before it's spoken. And then there are days like this. Celeste Monroe stood before the grand arched entrance of the Capitol Hill Council chamber, the late morning sun glinting against the amber stone columns, casting long shadows at her heels. Dressed in a deep emerald suit tailored to perfection, she exuded an effortless authority that made people shift slightly as she passed. She was here to protect a building, an aging brownstone, that had weathered riots, gentrification, and every whim of city development plans. But more than that, she was here to defend legacy, memory, the kinds of stories that are written in bricks, not ink. What she didn't expect was him. Not the man whose name had echoed across committee memos and campaign checks. Not the man she dismissed as another cold-blooded real estate titan with too much money and too little empathy. Daniel Whitaker. He stepped in 3 minutes late on purpose, of course. The type of man who didn't run behind but arrived just late enough to ensure every head turned. And they did. Not because he demanded attention, because he absorbed it. The kind of presence that quieted a room that whispered of power rather than shouted it. Celeste's breath caught for only half a second. Not because he was attractive, although he was graying at the temples, tall with that kind of posture that comes from years of dominating boardrooms, but because the moment his steel gray eyes scanned the room and landed on hers, something shifted, a flicker. Recognition maybe, though they'd never met. No one else seemed to notice it, but to Celeste the room tilted slightly. Ms. Monroe, the chairman, nodded, gesturing for her to take her seat. "We'll begin shortly." Daniel took his place across the long oak table, his charcoal suit impeccable, his jaw sharp, unmoved by the murmurs around him. Only when his gaze flicked toward her again, assessing interested but unreadable, did her spine straighten. Fine, if he wanted a show, she'd give him one. The meeting began with the usual formalities, budget reports, procedural votes, and the occasional cough echoing through the high ceiling. Celeste waited poised while Daniel rose for his presentation. Progress, he began, his baritone voice filling the chamber with unnerving ease, requires sacrifice. The Kenyan brownstone has stood abandoned for over 12 years. My proposal would replace it with a state-of-the-art multi-use facility. Jobs, revenue, a revival of the block. He moved with the grace of someone used to getting what he wanted, flicking through slides of glass towers and digital renderings like a maestro conducting an orchestra of progress. Celeste watched in silence, not because she was impressed, because she was calculating. When he finished, polite applause followed, then silence, until she rose. "Progress," she echoed, her voice calm but resonant. Such a noble word. But what are we sacrificing for it? She stepped forward, heels clicking against marble, the air shifting as the energy changed. "What Mr. Whitaker calls an abandoned building, I call the last standing memory of a black-owned bookstore that once gave refuge to students, immigrants, and revolutionaries alike. That brownstone isn't just brick and decay, it's heritage. It's a mirror to the neighborhood's soul." Daniel leaned back, arms folded, watching, listening. But his expression, neutral a moment ago, now held something else. Intrigue. Celeste brought up her own visuals, renderings of a restored facade, mixed-income housing, wrapped in history and hope. Her voice never wavered, not even when she glanced in his direction. "Luxury towers will rise and fall. But if we let every memory die to make room for someone's profit margin, what are we but a city without a past?" The room stilled. Even Daniel had nothing to say. Not yet. He stood again after a pause, slow and deliberate, as though the rhythm of their debate had become its own dance. "Your passion is admirable," he said, voice dipped in diplomacy. "But passion doesn't pour concrete. Sentiment doesn't cover payroll. Vision," he leaned in slightly, "must be practical." She took one step closer. Her perfumed jasmine and something he couldn't name lingered in the space between them. "Some things," she said softly, "are worth preserving, even if they don't turn a profit." And for a fleeting moment, no one else in the room existed. They were two forces, fire and steel, challenging, circling, seeing each other in ways that neither had prepared for. Later, as the committee recessed and papers shuffled and assistants hurried out, Daniel approached. Impressive, he said simply. Don't patronize me, Mr. Whitaker, she replied, but her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. I wasn't. I meant it. She nodded once, slipping her leather portfolio into her bag. Then something unexpected happened. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the entire chamber was plunged into darkness. A low rumble reverberated beneath their feet. Someone shouted. Emergency lights buzzed weakly to life. The ground shook. And in the span of seconds, chaos reigned. People screamed. Files flew. Plaster rained from the ceiling. Celeste stumbled. And a hand strong and steady caught her elbow. Daniel. Their eyes met in the flickering red glow. Basement archive, she gasped. People are down there. He hesitated for only a breath before nodding. Then we go. And as they ran toward the stairwell together, ducking falling beams and choking on dust, neither of them knew that this wasn't just the collapse of a building. It was the beginning of everything. Thank you for being here, beautiful soul. If this moment stirred something in you, if it made your heart race or your breath catch, consider leaving a little trace of yourself below. A comment, a thought, a memory. And if you'd like to stay for the full journey, click follow. Like the story, let's walk through the ruins and rise again together. There is something strangely intimate about disaster. Not the sirens or the headlines, not the chaos that lingers in its aftermath, but the moments in between, the hush before the collapse, the unspoken pact between strangers who suddenly become witnesses to each other's rawest, most human moments. For Celeste Monroe and Daniel Whitaker, that moment began in the stairwell of a crumbling Capitol Hill building. The emergency lights above flickered again, casting a crimson hue across the corridor like the slow pulse of a wounded heart. Celeste's breath came in quick, controlled bursts as they descended 2 flights toward the basement archive. Each tremor in the walls sent vibrations through her heels, rattling her bones and resolve in equal measure. Behind her, Daniel's voice cut through the thickening dust. Careful. Watch the railing. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The echo of screams above the dissonant groans of steel and plaster giving way, it was all too much. Her only focus was the door at the end of the hall, now crooked on its hinges, behind which a team of interns had been reviewing zoning records just minutes before. She pushed it open with her shoulder. Inside, fluorescent bulbs blinked erratically, illuminating the narrow aisles of file cabinets and aged maps now scattered like forgotten dreams. A young woman huddled beneath a metal table, sobbing softly. Another man clutched a bleeding arm, clearly dazed. We have to get them out, Celeste said, turning toward Daniel. He nodded. You take the girl. I've got him. Together without hesitation, they moved through the chaos with a strange synchronization, lifting, guiding, calming, with the kind of focus that comes not from training, but from instinct, from heart. They were halfway back toward the stairwell when it happened. A sound like thunder and then worse. A sudden sickening shift beneath their feet. The ceiling above them cracked open, dust and splinters raining down like ash from a fire not yet visible. The weight of the building groaned in protest, then gave way in one horrific exhale. Daniel didn't think, he acted. He pulled Celeste toward an alcove at the back of the archive, shoving open a small side door, barely wide enough for them both. He shielded her body with his own as concrete shattered and file cabinets toppled in a wave behind them. And then everything went still. No sound but the tiny whimper of metal settling. No light but the dull amber glow of a dying exit sign. No movement but their shallow, shaky breaths. Celeste felt his chest rise and fall against her back, his hand still braced protectively on her hip. She wasn't sure how long they stayed like that, 5 seconds or 5 minutes, but when the silence began to feel oppressive, she finally whispered, Are you hurt? I don't think so, he said hoarsely. You. She shifted slightly, winced at a bruised rib, but shook her head. Just rattled. Good, he murmured, and then paused. You're a damn fool, you know that. She turned, barely able to see his face in the dimness. Me? You ran into danger. So did you. He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh or just disbelief. I didn't know architects were trained for search and rescue. I wasn't rescuing. I was doing what was right. Their eyes met in the dark, the nearness between them sudden and electric. His palm still rested against her side, and only now did he seem to realize it. Slowly, deliberately, he let it fall away. "I think we're trapped," he said quietly, glancing at the mound of debris blocking the doorway. Celeste looked around their makeshift sanctuary, no more than an alcove between cabinets and concrete. It was barely large enough for two adults and certainly not made for comfort, but it had spared their lives. "Yes," she said finally, "but alive." He leaned his head back against the wall, exhaling hard. "Alive," he echoed. A silence fell over them again, but this time it was different. Not the silence of disaster, but of realization, of two people forced into stillness who had never allowed themselves to be still. Daniel removed his jacket, shaking off the dust, then folded it and offered it to her like a gentleman of another time. She hesitated, then accepted, pulling it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, touched more than she cared to admit. "I figured you'd get blood on your designer blazer." Despite everything, she smiled. Minutes passed, maybe hours. They didn't know. Time in that space was fluid, measured not in seconds but in exchanged glances, quiet confessions and breaths that mingled in the dark. "So," Daniel said at one point, his voice almost conversational, "what's your story?" She tilted her head. "You mean the resume or the life?" "Both," he said, eventually. She sighed. "Architect, preservationist, grew up in Alexandria, raised by my Aunt Bernice when my parents passed. I believe buildings carry memory. I believe not everything sacred is profitable, and I believe you think I'm naive for it." His voice was soft. "I don't." She turned to him, surprised. "I thought I did," he admitted. "But you stood your ground in that chamber, and again in the chaos. That's not naivety. That's courage." She blinked. "And you," she asked, her tone a little more guarded. "Private school, Ivy League, married young, widowed too soon, built an empire because it was easier than feeling. And now I build because I don't know what else to do." A beat. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "I'm sorry about your parents." They sat with that. And then slowly their fingers touched, just barely, just enough. Neither pulled away. In that crumbling building, beneath layers of dust and history and shared fear, something had cracked open, not just the ceiling above them, but something in themselves. Something they hadn't even realized had been locked away. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But when Celeste laid her head gently against Daniel's shoulder and felt his hand wrapped lightly around hers, it was more intimate than any embrace. Sometimes the foundation has to crack so something new can be built. And in the quiet wreckage of what once was a story neither of them expected had begun to unfold. In the stillness that followed the collapse, time lost its shape. Celeste couldn't recall when the distant echoes of rescue teams became the firm hands pulling her up through broken concrete. She didn't remember when the gray haze lifted from the air or when the biting daylight returned. Only that she had emerged from the ruins with Daniel's hand still clasped around hers, and for a heartbeat longer than necessary, neither of them let go. Sirens wailed, stretchers rattled, flashing lights blurred the world into fragmented color. But amid the chaos, she could feel it, that invisible thread that had tethered her to him in the darkness, still pulsing between them. Fragile, unspoken, real. They were both covered in dust and bruises, a contrast to the sharply dressed professionals they'd been just hours earlier. Her once immaculate emerald blazer was torn at the shoulder, and Daniel's white shirt bore a long streak of dried blood from shielding her under falling debris. But when the medics separated them standard protocol, they said neither argued. They just looked at each other and nodded, as if to say we're okay for now. The next few days passed in a flurry of news reports, insurance claims, and structural assessments. The press clung to the narrative tragedy narrowly avoided during council meeting. City leaders emerged heroes from rubble. Whitaker and Monroe clash then cooperate. Celeste didn't give interviews. She had no interest in being a headline. What mattered more were the people she'd helped out of that basement, the restoration plans now suspended indefinitely, and the persistent ache in her chest that had nothing to do with bruised ribs. It had everything to do with the man she hadn't spoken to since the rescue. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. What do you say to someone who saw you vulnerable in every way, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and didn't flinch, who held your shaking hands in the dark and said nothing but meant everything? She told herself it was best to leave the moment where it belonged behind her, in the ruins, in the dust. But memory had a way of clinging to her skin. 3 days later, as dusk settled over Georgetown, Celeste found herself standing at the window of her apartment, watching the horizon blur into indigo and gold. She had tried to bury herself in design mock-ups and restoration grant applications, but every line she drafted brought her back to that underground alcove. Every blueprint reminded her of the man who for a few fleeting hours hadn't been an adversary, but something else entirely. A knock startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there. No suit, no armor, just dark jeans, a soft gray sweater, and a paper bag in his hands that smelled unmistakably like Ethiopian takeout from the little place 2 blocks over. "You mentioned you liked injera," he said a little awkwardly, and I remembered. Celeste blinked, stunned not by the gesture, but by the gentleness of it. It disarmed her more thoroughly than any debate or earthquake. I I didn't think I'd see you again," she admitted, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't sure I should come," he replied, setting the food on her kitchen counter. But not coming felt worse. They sat across from each other at her small table, surrounded by warm lamplight and quiet. The meal was casual, injera lentils, collard greens, but the silence between bites was heavy with what hadn't yet been said. Finally, Daniel broke it. "That night," he said, looking directly at her, "it wasn't just fear. What I felt, when I held you, when you looked at me, that wasn't survival instinct." Celeste swallowed hard. "I know. I haven't stopped thinking about it, about you." She set her fork down slowly. "Daniel, we come from completely different worlds. You tear down buildings to make room for your future. I fight to save them because they carry mine." "I know," he said again. "And yet we fit in that tiny space underground in a way that didn't feel forced." She looked down, suddenly unsure of her voice. "I don't know what that means." "It means," he said, softer now, "that maybe we're not as different as we pretend. Maybe we both know what it means to lose something precious, to build walls around ourselves just to stay functional. Maybe it means we've been surviving alone for too long." Celeste met his gaze. He wasn't the man she'd pictured when she'd thought of safety. He was too sharp, too guarded, too practical. And yet, that night in the rubble, his voice had calmed her. His hands had steadied her. He hadn't run or crumbled or turned away from her fire. He had matched it. "You're not what I expected," she said barely above a whisper. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "Neither are you." They didn't touch. Not that night. The space between them remained filled with everything unsaid. But as Daniel stood to leave, he paused at the door and turned to her once more. "I'm not looking for anything casual, Celeste," he said. "And I'm not here to fix or be fixed. But I'd like to see you again if you're willing." She nodded. And after he left, she stood for a long time, with her hand resting on the door frame, the scent of warm spices lingering in the air, and a truth blooming slowly in her chest. Whatever had started in the dark hadn't ended there. It was still unfolding, like the aftershock of something much deeper than she was ready to name. For 2 weeks, they didn't touch the subject again. Not the near-death experience, not the electricity that sparked in the quiet between them, not the unspoken promise that trembled beneath the surface of their last conversation. Instead, they met at odd intervals, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for walks along the Georgetown Canal, where golden leaves floated like soft whispers on the water. Sometimes they didn't meet at all. A text would suffice, "Saw the article on your brownstone restoration. They should have let you speak longer." Or, "There's a bookstore on P Street that smells like cedar and bourbon. You'd love it." They were building something slowly. And yet, even in the hush of this unexpected closeness, Celeste felt the need to draw a line before feelings outran caution, before hope dressed itself as inevitability. That line came one chilly Wednesday evening, just as the air began to taste faintly of November. They sat at a small French bistro on the corner of Logan Circle, the kind of place that felt suspended in time candles, flickering in green glass, Edith Piaf murmuring overhead, servers moving like ghosts through the narrow space. Celeste wore a silk blouse the color of cream and a crimson wrap knotted loosely around her shoulders. Daniel, in a navy wool coat, had arrived early and ordered her favorite wine without needing to ask. He was listening, always listening. That was part of the problem. Before this continues, she said after the main course had been cleared, her voice steady but not cold. I need to say something. Daniel paused mid-reach for his glass. All right. I don't mix emotions with business or with causes I care about. That brownstone means something to me, Daniel. I've spent years fighting for its future. What happened between us, what's still happening, can't bleed into that. It can't cloud it. He studied her, his expression unreadable. You think I'd use what we shared against you? No, she said quickly, then softened. I think I might lose sight of myself if I'm not careful. The candle between them flickered, casting shadows that moved like memory across his face. I understand, he said quietly, but I don't want this us to be some buried detour you feel the need to apologize for. I'm not asking for guarantees, Celeste. Just honesty. You have it, she said, but I need boundaries. Name them. Her fingers traced the rim of her wine glass. We don't talk about work when we're together. We keep this out of the public eye. And if it becomes too much too complicated, we step away before we ruin something important. Daniel nodded once, as if she'd handed him the rules of a high-stakes negotiation. Fair, but I get to add one condition. Her brows arched, he leaned forward slightly, his voice like velvet. You don't hide behind caution so long that you forget how to feel. The word struck her, not like a weapon, but like a key. She wanted to argue, to retreat behind reason, behind the comfortable armor of distance and self-preservation. But his gaze was unwavering, not demanding, just present. And in it she saw not a man who wanted to conquer, but a man asking permission to stay. The rest of the evening passed in that suspended softness, like a delicate truce. They walked back to her brownstone in near silence, save for the quiet rhythm of their footsteps on cobblestone and the rustle of leaves in the gutters. Outside her door, Daniel hesitated. This is where I say goodnight, he said, a small, amused tilt at the corner of his mouth. And where I remind you we agreed on boundaries? He smirked. Yes, but I'm not breaking any rules by saying I think about you when you're not around. Celeste met his gaze, the warm porch light catching in her eyes like candlelight reflected in deep water. Good night, Daniel. She closed the door gently and then leaned against it, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was the kind of ache that came from restraint, not pain. The ache of someone who'd almost forgotten what it meant to be desired, without pressure, seen without judgment. Upstairs, she let her wrap fall from her shoulders and stood for a moment in the middle of her quiet room staring at the ceiling. What was she doing? She'd promised herself long ago that romance was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not with a life built on sacrifice, not with scars that still whispered at night, and certainly not with a man like Daniel Whitaker, who moved through the world like it owed him nothing, but gave him everything anyway. And yet, the memory of his voice lingered. You don't hide behind caution so long that you forget how to feel. The next morning, a small box sat on her office desk. No note, just a piece of smooth polished stone, inside black onyx carved into the shape of a keystone. A symbol of strength. A reminder of what holds everything together. She didn't need to guess who it was from. And as her fingers closed around it, warm from the sun streaming through the window, Celeste felt it again, the soft beginnings of something daring. Something she hadn't planned. A quiet revolution in the chambers of her heart. Distance, when chosen, can feel like protection. But distance that unravels on its own, bit by bit, glance by glance, is something else entirely. It is surrender in slow motion. Celeste Monroe had once believed herself a master of boundaries. With precision honed from years in advocacy and restoration, she had learned to compartmentalize pain in one box, purpose in another. Private wounds stitched in silence, public poise tailored to perfection. Even her apartment bore the signs of her discipline, minimalist, orderly, restrained. But Daniel Whitaker didn't follow rules like she did. Not because he broke them recklessly, but because he moved around them as if they were written in sand. And somehow, without forcing anything, he had begun to inch closer. It started with the small things. A text during a sudden cold snap, check your stoop. You'll need this. She opened her door to find a pair of deep brown leather gloves lined with fleece and fitted just for her. A voicemail left after he'd caught the tail end of one of her interviews on local radio. You sounded like you were sculpting words from marble. I listened twice. You made me believe preservation is poetry. She told herself not to read into these gestures. But feelings once invited in are not so easily dismissed. They linger in the corners, in the shadows of rooms once meant to be silent. One Friday evening, they met at the National Portrait Gallery, not for a date, but because the architecture itself demanded reverence. She arrived late, rain beating on the collar of her coat, and found him standing in front of a painting of a jazz singer whose voice Celeste had grown up hearing in the background of her aunt's kitchen. Daniel didn't say anything, just looked over and gave her a nod that felt more like a welcome than a greeting. They walked in near silence for an hour, letting the past breathe around them. In the Lincoln Hall under the high dome, she paused beside a sculpture of a mother holding a child whose face was carved into a perfect sphere, unfinished, symbolic. Do you ever think about legacy, she asked. Daniel tilted his head, all the time, but lately not the kind I used to. What kind did you used to think about? Buildings, shares, names on cornerstones. He glanced at her. Now, it's different. I think about what I'll leave behind that breathes, that remembers. She said nothing, but her chest rose with something like ache. Later that night, they walked together down 7th Street past the closed bookstores and jazz clubs, with neon still flickering behind drawn blinds. The rain had thinned into a mist that caught in Celeste's lashes. As they reached the mouth of an alleyway lined with string lights from an adjacent cafe, she turned to face him. I don't know what to do with this, she said softly. This is more. Jamawo, you, me. The fact that we weren't supposed to matter this much to each other. Not this quickly. Daniel didn't reach for her. He didn't close the space. Instead, he simply answered, we don't have to define it, but we don't have to ignore it either. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was expectant. She stepped closer, not into his arms, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder. And for a moment, they just stood like that. Two people who had once been strangers, now something less easily explained. The next week, distance gave way again. It happened one evening after Celeste had a brutal meeting with the Historic Preservation Commission. The funding for her proposed community space had been stalled. Again, politics, delays, more questions about her attachment to emotionally charged projects. By the time she arrived home, she was bone-tired and out of grace. There was a knock 20 minutes later. Daniel. He didn't ask what was wrong. He handed her a paper bag with Thai takeout and simply said, you don't have to talk, but I can stay or go. Your call. She let him in. They didn't talk much. She ate in silence while he sat cross-legged on her floor, telling a ridiculous story about a board member who once mistook a wine auction paddle for a fan during a blackout fundraiser. She laughed, really laughed for the first time in days. And when the laughter faded, he didn't reach for her, but he looked at her like he wanted to. I'm not good at letting people help, she said almost in apology. You don't have to be, he replied. Just don't push away the ones who want to. After that night, something shifted again. The spaces between their meetings grew shorter, the silences richer. She learned he played piano rarely privately and had a baby grand tucked into a sunlit corner of his penthouse. He learned she kept every sketch she'd ever done since high school folded neatly into manila folders, stacked in her bedroom closet like pressed flowers. She showed him her favorite alley murals in Adams Morgan. He took her to a rooftop greenhouse in DuPont Circle he'd funded anonymously, where strawberries grew in recycled barrels and bees moved like golden punctuation. They didn't call it dating. They didn't name what they were doing. But every glance across a restaurant table, every brush of hands as they passed in narrow corridors, every late-night message that said, thinking of you without saying it at all, each was a chisel carving slowly into the stone wall she had built around her heart. One night as they sat on a bench beneath the Kennedy Center after a chamber recital, she turned to him and said, I think I've been preparing for disappointment so long, I forgot what it feels like to want something and believe I could actually have it. Daniel reached for her hand, not forcefully, but deliberately, and held it between his own. Then let's forget the preparing, he said, and just feel it, even if it's only for this moment. Celeste looked down at their hands intertwined like roots. And for the first time in years, she didn't brace for the fall. She let herself feel the weight of his touch, the warmth of a present moment, the undoing of distance. Not in a grand cinematic way, but in the quiet knowing that something fragile and real was beginning to take hold. Even in a city built on monuments, some ghosts never leave. They don't haunt marble or echo through galleries. They whisper in boardrooms. They linger in the back row of public hearings. They smile politely at fundraisers with champagne flutes in hand, still gatekeeping the future with the velvet gloves of tradition and legacy. Celeste Monroe had spent her life learning how to navigate these ghosts, but she hadn't expected one of them to wear Daniel's last name. It was a Thursday morning, thick with humidity, the kind that made summer in D.C. feel like a slow exhale. Celeste stood on the steps of the Franklin Arts Conservatory, her proposal folder pressed to her chest. Inside 24 pages outlining her vision to restore and repurpose the old DuPont foundry into a community art and history space. A dream 3 years in the making. A legacy she wanted to give back to the city that had raised her. She didn't notice the town car until it pulled up to the curb. Didn't notice the man until he stepped out trim, elegant in his late 60s, with silver hair combed back like a politician from another era. His suit was immaculate, his expression razor-edge behind civility. Celeste Monroe, he said, offering a hand she instinctively didn't want to take. I've heard your name. I'm Charles Whitaker. The handshake was brief, cold. Daniel's father, he clarified as if reading her hesitation. Yes, she replied, her voice poised but wary. I know who you are. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I thought I'd introduce myself before this morning's vote. I serve as vice chair on the conservatory's acquisition board. I understand your project has drawn considerable attention. Celeste felt it then, the subtle tightening of the air, the unspoken tension that often preceded polite sabotage. Thank you, she said. The foundry deserves new life. Its history matters. Of course, Charles said, studying her as if appraising a sculpture that might look better elsewhere. History is important, as is the company we keep while shaping it. She held his gaze. I agree. He stepped closer, not threatening, but precise. My son has a tendency to invest his affections with passionate urgency. I don't fault him for it. It's the artist in him, perhaps. But I do caution those who grow close. The Whitaker name carries responsibility, expectations, discretion. There it was, a warning wrapped in etiquette. Celeste didn't flinch. I appreciate the concern, she said smoothly, but I don't need to be reminded of the weight of names. I was raised by a woman who taught me to build a life worthy of her own, even when the city forgot hers. I know about legacy, and I know about gatekeepers who like to hold the keys even after the doors have changed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Before he could respond, the conservatory doors opened, and a staffer called her name. She offered Charles a nod and walked inside, spine-straight folder firm in her hands. The meeting was long. Too many hands, too many suits, too many veiled critiques delivered under the guise of due diligence. Still, Celeste held her ground. She spoke of memory as infrastructure, of how art and history, when intertwined, could anchor communities adrift in gentrification. She spoke of her aunt's neighborhood garden, where murals bloomed on brick walls long before developers arrived, of the children who'd never set foot in a gallery, but found belonging through brushstrokes on public concrete. When she finished, there was silence. Not the silence of dismissal. The silence of minds shifted slightly reluctantly. Then murmurs of approval, a few nods. Not unanimous, but enough. Her proposal passed into the final phase. She exited the building not with triumph, but with clarity and a quiet fire beneath her ribs. Outside, she found Daniel waiting by the iron gate, leaning against the street lamp, as if he'd been standing there for hours. I told you I could do this on my own, she said, approaching. I didn't come to save you, he said gently. I came because I knew they'd try to test you, and because I didn't want you to face their ghosts alone. She searched his face and saw no guilt, no trace of his father in his eyes, only a man who had learned how to be different. I met him, she said. Daniel looked away. I figured. He wanted me to know where the lines were. That legacy for men like him still means control. Daniel nodded. It always did, even when I was a child. Celeste softened, sensing the grief beneath his quiet. I'm not afraid of his name, she said. I know, but I'm afraid of what it might cost you to carry it even by proximity. Her voice was almost a whisper. I don't want your name. I just want your truth. He stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint cedar and ink that always clung to him. My truth is this, he said. You make me want to build things that last. Not just towers, not just headlines, but meaning. A breath caught between them. And then, almost without thinking, she reached up and brushed her fingertips along his jaw. A simple gesture, but in its tenderness, 100 walls crumbled. He leaned into her touch, eyes closing just for a second, as if anchoring himself there. And when she dropped her hand, they didn't need to say anything more. They walked together through the city, not as symbols, not as stories, but as something unfinished. Something neither father nor boardroom nor memory could contain. And in the quiet between their footsteps, the past no longer loomed. It simply stood behind them like an old gate finally left open. Some storms don't arrive with thunder. Some come quietly like a single envelope on a kitchen table. Plain, unassuming, world-altering. Celeste had seen it happen to others. Friends, colleagues, women who had carried dreams of motherhood like heirlooms, only to watch them shatter against sterile clinic walls and whispered diagnoses. She had never allowed herself to imagine that kind of grief. Not because she believed she was immune to it, but because she had trained herself not to hope. And where hope did not bloom, loss could not take root. Or so she thought. It had been a lingering fatigue at first, a stubborn nausea that refused to be explained away by stress or skipped meals. She'd assumed it was exhaustion, another project deadline, another late-night drafting policy proposals by lamplight. But then came the dizziness, the strange aversions, the sudden craving for citrus at odd hours. And then the absence. Her cycle, once as precise as the ticking of her grandmother's heirloom clock, simply didn't arrive. Celeste hadn't told Daniel. Not yet. Instead, she found herself standing in the back corner of a quiet pharmacy on a Sunday morning, her coat buttoned high against the February chill, holding a slim white box like it might detonate in her hands. It wasn't fear that paralyzed her. It was possibility. She had lived decades with the certainty that her body had drawn a boundary she couldn't cross. She'd made peace with it, or at the very least she had filed it into the silent drawer of acceptance, next to other griefs she didn't talk about. Her marriage years ago had not survived that truth. Not because she hadn't wanted children, but because he couldn't live with what she lacked, couldn't look at her without seeing absence, couldn't build a life where family came without biology, where love was enough on its own. He had left, quietly. No blame, he said, only biology. A single word that had chased her like a shadow for 30 years. And now, this. The box sat unopened on her bathroom counter for hours. She tried to busy herself sorting grant applications, folding laundry, even baking a banana bread loaf that went uneaten. But every noise in the apartment felt louder. Every second stretched. When she finally took the test, she didn't look at it right away. She placed it face down, washed her hands, poured a glass of water, stared out the window at the bare branches moving gently in the wind. Then, with a breath held so tightly it hurt, she turned it over. 2 pink lines. She stared, blinked, read the instructions again. 2 lines, not a maybe, not a faint whisper of hope. A declaration. Celeste sat down on the edge of the tub, the test trembling in her fingers. She was pregnant. For a long time she didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply sat in the stillness, feeling the world tilt on its axis. She told Daniel 2 nights later. They were sitting in his apartment, lights low, music playing softly in the background, an old Ella Fitzgerald track that made the room feel wrapped in velvet. He was reading something on his tablet glasses perched low on his nose, a look of quiet concentration on his face. She almost didn't say it. But then he looked up and smiled, warm and unguarded, and she knew she couldn't hold it any longer. I have something to tell you, she said. He set the tablet down, immediately sensing her seriousness. What is it? She took a breath. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed wasn't like the silence in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was something softer, almost reverent. He stared at her blinking once, as if translating the words into something he could hold. And then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not mockingly, not out of disbelief, but with a kind of awe that made her chest ache. "You're serious," he said, rising slowly, moving to kneel in front of where she sat on the couch. "You're you're really—" She nodded, her eyes suddenly glassy. "I double-checked and then triple-checked." He didn't touch her at first. Just knelt there, hands on his knees like a man who had wandered into a sacred place and wasn't sure how to breathe. Then gently he placed his palm on her abdomen. There was no bump yet, only warmth potential. "Celeste," his voice broke slightly. "I didn't think, I mean, we never even talked about—" "I didn't think it was possible," she whispered. Neither of them moved for a long time. Then Daniel sat beside her, pulling her into his arms with a care that said, "I understand this isn't just joy. This is terror and wonder and memory and rebirth all in one." "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "Not this, not a future, not a decision. I'll be here in whatever way you need." Celeste leaned into him, bearing her face into his shoulder. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Then we'll find out together." She thought about how easily those words could have turned to promises, about how tempting it was to write a new story with this man who had never asked her to be more than she was. But she also knew that life was rarely linear. There would be questions, doctors, doubts. There would be her past clawing its way to the surface, her ex-husband, her age, the headlines that might follow once word got out. But in this moment, curled into Daniel's warmth, her heartbeat no longer just her own, Celeste let herself believe that maybe the test wasn't only about biology. Maybe it was about courage. The courage to love again. The courage to carry what once seemed impossible. The courage to rise each day not with certainty, but with quiet, unwavering hope. The ultrasound room was cool and humming with sterile light. Celeste lay back on the crisp, white paper of the exam table, one hand gripping the edge as though anchoring herself to reality. Daniel sat just beside her, his chair too small for his frame, his posture too still for a man who usually radiated quiet motion. The technician, young, efficient, cheerful in that practiced way, rolled the gel across Celeste's belly and began the scan. The screen beside them flickered to life, displaying shifting shadows in hues of gray and white. Celeste didn't dare blink. "There's the heartbeat," the tech said, turning the monitor slightly so they both could see. Strong, healthy, right where it should be. A soft flutter filled the room, fast, persistent, rhythmic. Daniel's hand found hers. His grip was firm but trembling. Celeste didn't smile. Not yet. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen, trying to memorize the shape of that flicker, that sound, that proof. And then, "Number de souris you remain." "Wait," the technician murmured, frowning, but not in concern. She moved the wand slightly, pressed again, paused. "Hold on." Celeste's breath caught. Daniel tensed. The tech's frown melted into a grin. "Well," she said, her voice suddenly light, "it looks like congratulations are in order." Twice over. Celeste blinked. "I'm sorry, what happened to rare Sunderman to Tierman?" "There are two," the woman said, pointing at the screen. "One here, and one here. You're having twins." The room went silent, then seconds later filled with a double beat. Two tiny pulses alternating and overlapping, like wings fluttering against time, like music composed by fate. Celeste could not speak. Twins. The word felt enormous, sacred. She turned to Daniel, who looked as though someone had taken the floor out from beneath him and replaced it with sky. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but his eyes glistened. "Two," he whispered. Celeste nodded slowly, unable to form words. The technician finished her work with efficiency, printing the scans and offering quiet congratulations before leaving them alone in the softly humming room. Neither of them spoke at first. Celeste looked down at her belly, still flat, still ordinary on the outside, while a miracle was happening just beneath the surface. "I never thought I'd hear that sound," she said finally. Daniel turned toward her, voice thick. "Neither did I." "It's terrifying," she admitted. He smiled, brushing a thumb over her knuckles. "Yes, but so are all the best things." They walked through the park after the appointment under a canopy of elm trees just beginning to green. The air was crisp and the city moved around them, unaware that two heartbeats had just changed everything. Have you thought about what it means? Daniel asked gently. Celeste didn't answer right away. She watched a pair of children racing up a hill, their laughter trailing like kites in the wind. I spent so long convincing myself I wouldn't be a mother, she said, that it wasn't part of my story. I buried that ache so deep I thought I'd forgotten where I left it. Daniel was quiet. But now she continued, it's like everything inside me is being rewritten. Not erased, just revised. You're not alone in this, he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. I know, and I don't take that lightly. There was a pause, gentle and full. Then Daniel asked, do you want to tell people? Eventually, she said, but not yet. I want to hold it close for a while. Let it be ours before it belongs to the world. He nodded. We can do that. Celeste took his arm again as they resumed walking. The city buzzed and bloomed around them, but inside her life bloomed more quietly, more powerfully. She thought of the little heartbeats. Their sound still echoed in her ears. She had expected tears at that moment, but what she felt was something older, deeper. A reverence, like standing at the edge of something vast. That night Celeste stood before the mirror in her bedroom, wrapped in a long cotton robe, staring at herself. There was nothing yet to see. No curve of promise, no outward sign of the lives within. But she touched her stomach gently, her fingers resting flat. Hello, she whispered. The room stayed still as if listening. I don't know if I'll be good at this, she said softly. But I waited my whole life to meet you, even when I didn't know I was waiting. And I think I'm ready to begin. Behind her, Daniel stood at the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped in, walked to her slowly, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, one hand covering hers the other, pressing over her heart. Together they looked at the mirror, not at the absence of a bump, but at the fullness of presence. It wasn't just her reflection anymore, it was theirs. And though they had not planned for it, nor sought it, nor dared to hope for it, they had already become a family. Not because of biology, not because of timing, but because somehow, through the wreckage of past grief and the quiet beginnings of something new, they had chosen each other. And now two heartbeats whispered in tandem beneath the silence growing louder with each passing day. There are objects that vanish with time letters, that fade photographs, that yellow promises that dissolve. But some things remain. Celeste Monroe had not worn the ring in years, and yet it still lived in the velvet box at the bottom of her cedar drawer, wrapped in the same silk handkerchief her aunt had pressed into her palm the day she'd left her first home as a wife. It wasn't the stone that mattered. It was modest oval encased in a worn platinum band. Nor was it the man who had given it to her. That man had chosen silence over struggle, detachment over devotion. He had whispered vows with hands already half loosed. What lingered was what she had once placed into it. Hope, faith in forever. A belief that love, if pure, could survive even the absence of children. She had been wrong about that. And yet somehow the ring had survived. Not because of what it had symbolized, but because of what it had witnessed. It was nearly midnight when Celeste opened the drawer. The twins were a soft flutter beneath her ribs, still too small to shift her posture, but strong enough now to dance. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, one hand draped over the open pages of a book he'd never finished. A slow jazz record played in the background, one of her favorites, a Nina Simone album he'd tracked down on vinyl, because you said her voice feels like home. In the quiet, surrounded by the hum of a city finally catching its breath, Celeste unfolded the handkerchief. The ring glimmered faintly, catching the lamp's amber glow. It still fit her finger. Not perfectly, a little tighter now, but it slid into place as if remembering its old home. She stared at it, not with nostalgia, not even with pain, but with observation, as if it belonged to a former life she now watched from across a gallery rope. And then a knock. Soft, hesitant. She turned. Daniel stood in the doorway, hair tousled shirt, wrinkled eyes still thick with sleep. I didn't mean to wake you, she said, slipping the ring off quickly, not in shame but in instinct. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at her, really looked. You wore it, he said finally. Celeste exhaled, sat on the edge of the bed and held the ring in her palm. It was part of who I was for a long time. Daniel stepped into the room slowly, deliberately, and sat beside her. Not too close. Not asking for a place in the past. I never asked about him, he said gently. I wouldn't have answered, she replied, her voice even. He nodded. Do you want to now? She turned the ring over in her hand, then met his gaze. No, because he's not the story anymore. He was a page, but he wasn't the ending. Daniel reached out not for the ring, but for her hand. What I see, he said softly, is a woman who survived more than most will ever know. A woman who rebuilt her soul with silence and steel, and who's now carrying something that belongs entirely to her. Celeste looked at him, eyes searching. What if I'm still learning how to carry it? He smiled, that quiet, lopsided smile she'd grown to crave. Then we'll learn together. She placed the ring back in its box, not in rejection, but in farewell. Carefully, reverently, like placing a final punctuation mark at the end of a long letter she no longer needed to send. The next day she stood before her office window as the sunlight poured through, golden and soft. On her desk lay a letter, an invitation from the National Museum to curate a new exhibit centered on motherhood across generations of Black women in D.C. A project she had proposed years ago, rejected, forgotten, but now suddenly revived. The curator's note had been handwritten. Your story changed how I saw the world. Maybe it's time others see it too. Celeste pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, we're not just writing history, we are history. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. A photo came through a tiny ring box, not hers, his. A simple caption. When you're ready, I'd like to give you one that starts a new story. She smiled, not because she had decided, not yet, but because she could. Later that night, Daniel found her on the rooftop of his building, curled into a blanket, sipping ginger tea and watching the lights of the city blink, like stars turned sideways. He didn't ask about the ring. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat beside her, their shoulders touching, and pointed toward the east. Over there, he said, that's where the sun will come up. I figured we'd wait for it. Celeste turned to him, a breath caught in her throat. For what? For the beginning. And so they sat, hearts humming in unison, with the double rhythm inside her, letting the night pass gently into dawn together, not rewriting the past, but finally turning the page. And as the horizon glowed pale with promise, the memory of the old ring faded behind them, while the future shimmered, bright, bold, and entirely their own. The moment it all unraveled didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with silence. A silence too deliberate, too sharp, the kind that made rooms echo in ways they hadn't before. Celeste stood in the middle of her kitchen, hands gripping the marble edge of the counter. The kettle hissed behind her, forgotten. The pregnancy journal Daniel had given her, leather-bound and filled with her looping cursive, lay open beside the sink. Its pages fluttered in the breeze coming through the cracked window, as if searching for a line that might explain this aching rupture. Daniel was upstairs. He hadn't spoken since last night, and what had been said had sliced through everything they'd been carefully building. It had started with a name Celeste hadn't heard in nearly 3 decades. Her ex-husband, Graham Ellison, was running for public office, senator no less, backed by the same families that had once whispered behind Celeste's back when the divorce papers were filed. Whispers about infertility, about a marriage that had failed before it even began, about how a man like Graham needed a real family to match his ambitions. And now, as if summoned by fate, Graham's face had returned, plastered across morning news digital billboards and printed pamphlets that made their way even to the front desk of her nonprofit. But it wasn't the publicity that cracked her open. It was the interview. One Daniel had forwarded to her without comment, without context, as if wanting her to see before anyone else did. In it, Graham sat beneath the polished lights of a studio, calm, measured, smiling in that practiced, hollow way politicians did. When asked about family, he gestured toward his wife, young, beautiful, pregnant, with their 3rd child, and spoke of the joy of building something lasting after early heartbreaks. Then the journalist asked, "Do you have any regrets?" Graham hesitated for just a breath. "I regret wasting time believing in impossible futures," he said smoothly. "Some things just aren't meant to be. Some people were never meant to be mothers." Celeste had stopped breathing. Daniel had been watching from across the room, expecting her to rage. But she hadn't, not immediately. She'd simply stood, walked to the window and stared. For a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, almost too calm. He still carries that lie like a badge. Daniel's expression darkened. I shouldn't have sent it. No, I needed to see it. Then silence stretched between them. And Celeste, unable to contain the weight, whispered, he's going to win. Daniel didn't deny it. And maybe that was the problem. Because what she needed wasn't realism. She needed defiance. She needed him to stand beside her and say, not if I can help it. But Daniel, ever careful, ever diplomatic, said instead, we can stay above it. Celeste turned, her heart cracking. Above it, he just erased me in front of millions of people. And your answer is elevation. He stepped forward. Celeste, you think I want revenge, she interrupted, voice rising. I want truth. I want to reclaim what he took. I want our children to know they were not the result of pity or miracle. They were possible all along. I was always enough, even when no one saw it. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'm not asking you to play politics, she added, quieter now. I'm asking you to see me, fully. And he did, but not with the ease she'd hoped for. Because what he saw terrified him, a woman on the cusp of something too raw to contain a fire that might burn even the good they'd found together. So he said nothing. And that silence, that was the breaking point. That night she packed a small bag. Not out of vengeance, not out of pride, but out of necessity. She needed clarity. She needed to stand alone just for a moment to remember who she had become after all those years of being forgotten. When she reached the door, Daniel stood at the bottom of the stairs. Are you leaving me? He asked, voice low. No, she whispered. I'm finding me. His shoulders sank. She reached out, touched his chest gently. If we're going to make it, I need you to walk with me, not ahead of me, not behind, beside. Daniel nodded, pain etched in every line of his face. And for the first time in weeks, they didn't kiss goodbye. Celeste spent 3 nights at her aunt's old house in LeDroit Park. The home she'd once found too small, too loud with memory, but now its creaking floorboards and chipped window frames held her gently, like arms long unseen. She journaled. She cooked. She reread the letters her aunt had left behind, words scrawled with ink and grace, and a quiet defiance that ran in Celeste's blood. She remembered who she was before anyone had touched her with doubt. And when she returned home on the 4th morning, the air between her and Daniel had changed. Not cooled. Cleared. He met her at the door, no grand gestures, no apologies rehearsed. Just him. And when she stepped inside, they didn't speak right away. They simply stood, 2 people who had hurt and healed, and circled each other through fire and silence, and reached tentatively for one another. Sometimes love doesn't break because it's weak. Sometimes it breaks because it's real, because it needs space to grow stronger, because honesty is not a clean road. It's a narrow bridge built plank by plank between 2 hearts brave enough to still try. Celeste and Daniel stood on that bridge now, not ready to run across, but ready to build the next step, together. The call came at 4:17 a.m., the hour of honest shadows. Celeste jolted upright in bed, heart pounding before her mind could register the sound. The phone buzzed again on the nightstand, vibrating in tight, urgent bursts. Daniel stirred beside her, groggy and confused. Who is it? He murmured. She didn't answer. The name on the screen made her breath catch. Kennedy Women's Clinic. For one split second, her fingers froze. Then she pressed accept. Ms. Monroe came, the nurse's voice clipped but calm. You need to come in, now. By the time they reached the hospital, dawn had not yet broken. The city outside was still wrapped in hush. The streets ghosted with mist and headlights. Daniel parked in a red zone, barely noticing the violation, and helped Celeste out of the car with hands that shook more than hers. She felt no pain, just a strange, hollow stillness in her abdomen, as though something had paused, not stopped, but waited. Inside, the fluorescent lights glared like interrogators. Nurses moved quickly, but with careful precision, offering polite instructions and tense smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They ushered her into the exam room. Daniel tried to follow, but the nurse gently held out a hand. Give us 5 minutes, she said. He nodded, stepping back. His eyes never left Celeste. She lay on the table in silence, the cool gel once again spreading across her skin like a thin layer of fear. The doctor, Dr. Laramie, who had held her hand during her first scan, entered with quiet authority and placed the transducer on her stomach. The screen flickered. One heartbeat, then another, both steady, both strong. Celeste didn't realize she had been holding her breath until she released it in a broken sob. "They're okay," the doctor said softly, her voice smoothing the edges of the moment. "But we saw some deceleration during your overnight monitor. Stress-related. We'll need to keep you for a few days." Celeste nodded, too overcome to speak. In the hospital room later, she lay propped up in bed, dressed in one of those drafty gowns that made everyone feel like a patient even before they were one. The twins fluttered inside her, now soft reminders that life could still whisper when it wasn't screaming. Daniel sat beside her, elbows on knees, head bowed. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "This is my fault." She looked at him, startled. "I should have pushed back harder when Graham's name surfaced," he continued. "I should have protected you. I thought staying quiet was respectful, but silence isn't strength, Celeste. It's cowardice. I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, so I said nothing. And it hurt you." His words landed like small, precise drops of rain, quiet but heavy. Celeste reached for his hand. "You didn't do this," she said, voice firm. "Fear did. Mine, yours. And we're both learning how not to let it win." Daniel looked up, his eyes shining. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it out loud. She had known, of course she had, but to hear it now in a hospital room where dreams and fears collided like thunderclouds, it hit differently. More raw, more real. "I love you," she echoed, her voice catching. The next morning, the nurses wheeled her into the perinatal suite, where high-risk pregnancies were monitored more closely. As the sunlight broke through the window, casting long, golden fingers across the floor, Celeste found herself staring out at the horizon. For years, she had feared this very moment, that her body would fail her again, that joy would be followed by devastation, that hope was a cruel trick. But something had shifted. The scare had not broken her. It had awakened her. Not just to the fragility of life, but to its ferocity. She saw it now in the steady beat of her baby's hearts, in the unwavering line of Daniel's spine, as he stood at her bedside, refusing to look away. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a reckoning. She had been made to believe her worth depended on biology, on outcomes, on whether or not her body could do what others expected of it. But now, with two tiny hearts beating beneath her own, she understood her worth had never been in what she could produce. It was in what she could hold, endure, grow, rise from. Later that evening, as the hospital settled into its rhythm of beeps and murmurs, Daniel pulled out his laptop. "What are you doing?" Celeste asked softly. He didn't look up, writing a statement. A statement. He turned the screen toward her. It was a draft op-ed titled "The Woman He Erased." "I'm done staying above it," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You don't have to speak, but I will. You're not just a woman carrying twins. You're the woman who shaped policy that helped thousands of underserved mothers. You're the reason I rejoined the board of my own foundation, and no one, least of all Graham Ellison, is going to bury that truth." Celeste felt something bloom in her chest, not just love, pride, in him, in them, in who they were becoming together. She took his hand. "Then let's tell the truth," she said, her voice clear. And together, under the sterile hospital lights and the soft thrum of new life growing stronger, with every beat, they began to rewrite the narrative, not for revenge, but for remembrance. Because sometimes the wake-up call doesn't come to break you, it comes to show you that you're finally ready to rise. Hospitals held a silence that wasn't truly silent. It was a quiet, layered with life, soft footsteps down polished halls. The rhythmic whisper of heart monitors murmured shift changes between nurses. But for Celeste Monroe, that silence had become something else entirely. It had become sacred. Because this time it wasn't the sound of endings. It was the sound of beginnings. She had been in the hospital for 4 days now, 4 long, watchful days of bed rest, fetal monitoring, and careful optimism. The twins were holding strong. Her body, though fatigued and under constant observation, remained steady. The doctors reassured her hourly. The nurses smiled more easily with each shift. And Daniel had not left her side. Every morning he arrived with black coffee she couldn't drink just to keep the ritual intact. Every afternoon he read to her from a worn anthology of Baldwin essays, his voice soft but certain. And every evening he fell asleep on the narrow pull-out couch near her bed, one hand often stretched out as if reaching for her even in his dreams. But this morning was different. This morning the nurse had smiled in a way that carried meaning. "The doctor will be in shortly," she said, a touch of excitement in her tone. "He's bringing your charts, and good news." Celeste sat up straighter. Her body had grown used to waiting, but her spirit hadn't. Inside her, the twins continued their quiet dance, shifting and pulsing, like new constellations forming behind the veil of skin and time. The door opened. Dr. Laramie stepped in her white coat, folded neatly, her tablet already in hand. "Well," she said with a grin that softened her usual clinical sharpness, "your vitals have stabilized beautifully. The twins are progressing exactly as we'd hoped for at this stage, and your stress markers have decreased significantly. If this continues until tomorrow morning, we'll discharge you." Celeste blinked. "Discharge is Sushornmeiden can Kidinermeinjurns. To complete your bed rest at home. Still no stairs, still no long walks, but home, with someone who can care for you." She nodded toward Daniel, who had just walked in with a small bouquet of peonies. "Did I miss something?" he asked, eyes darting. Celeste turned to him with the faintest tear in her eye. "We might be going home." He looked at Dr. Laramie, then back at Celeste. And then slowly he smiled. Not the practiced smile of comfort, but the unguarded one. His lips parted just slightly, his eyes softening as though he could see it all unfolding before them. The nursery, the early morning feedings, the laughter of two children who did not yet know how many hopes had been pinned to their very existence. Later that afternoon, the hospital garden called to her. She had not walked more than a few feet in days, but Dr. Laramie approved it. 10 minutes in a wheelchair wrapped in sunlight and fresh air. Daniel wheeled her slowly down the long corridor and out into the courtyard. The sky stretched in pastel shades above them, dappled with cloud light and warmth. They stopped beneath a flowering dogwood tree, its branches low and wide like arms mid-embrace. Celeste tilted her face toward the breeze. "It smells like spring." "It is spring," Daniel said, kneeling beside her. "It's the season of second chances." She laughed. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. She looked down at her stomach, her hands gently resting atop it. "They're quiet today." "They're probably listening," he said, placing his hand next to hers. "They know something's coming." Celeste turned to him, her smile giving way to something more serious. "Have you thought about names?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I've written a few down." She raised an eyebrow. He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with sheepish care. "I didn't want to say anything until it felt real," he admitted. "But now it does." She took the list. On it scrawled in neat print were a dozen names, some classic, some unusual, all carefully chosen. Near the bottom, 2 names were circled. Julian, Maeve. Celeste's breath caught. "These are beautiful." "They're yours," Daniel said. "Ours." That night, the city outside the hospital glowed softly, the way cities do, when hope rises gently instead of bursting forth. Celeste lay in bed, lights dimmed, her fingers still brushing the edge of the list. Daniel sat beside her, his hand wrapped around hers. They said little now. Words felt too small. But silence could carry everything. In a hospital once filled with her greatest fears, Celeste had found a strange and astonishing kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but of readiness. She no longer felt haunted by what had been lost. She felt chosen by what had endured. 2 heartbeats pulsing steadily within her. A man beside her who had not rewritten her story, but waited patiently for her to write it herself. And as she drifted into sleep, one hand over her belly, the other curled into his, she dreamed not of the past, but of laughter in sunlit kitchens, of tiny feet thudding across hardwood floors, of 2 children who would never doubt they were wanted, who would never hear the word barren, who would grow knowing their mother had defied what the world told her was impossible. She dreamed of coming home. The first morning home was wrapped in amber. Sunlight filtered through gauzy linen curtains in Daniel's townhouse, illuminating dust motes like golden snowflakes suspended in time. The city beyond the windows hummed, but inside everything was slow, sacred, and still. Celeste stood in the nursery doorway, barefoot wrapped in a cream robe, her hair coiled loosely atop her head. One hand rested gently on her belly, the other held a steaming cup of nettle tea. The room was nearly finished. Soft sage walls, white oak crib, a plush chair beside the window where she already imagined herself curled at midnight, a sleepy twin tucked against her chest. Daniel had built the crib himself, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. She stepped inside, toes sinking into the thick wool rug. A framed quote above the changing table read, "We are the ancestors of tomorrow." It had been her idea, and now standing here, she could feel the weight and beauty of that truth. In the days that followed, their lives were filled with quiet rituals. Morning walks slow and measured through the garden courtyard, with Daniel's hand bracing her elbow like a whispered promise. Midday naps wrapped in throw blankets and Nina Simone. Evenings spent reading the journal she'd begun keeping again, the one for the babies. She wrote them letters they would one day read, filled with truths she had once been afraid to say aloud. And alongside these rituals, something unexpected bloomed. Purpose. Not the kind she had once worn like armor in her career. This was softer, rooted deeper. The museum exhibit she'd proposed months ago, the one focused on the stories of Black women across generations, was greenlit. She had almost forgotten about the proposal submitted quietly and without fanfare, like a prayer you're not sure anyone will hear. But someone had heard, and this time she wouldn't tell the story as a curator standing behind a pane of glass. She would tell it as someone who had lived it. Daniel encouraged her from the start, offering his home office as her makeshift planning hub. Her notes soon overtook the wall's family trees, photographs, articles written on yellowing newsprint. Some stories were famous, others nearly lost. But all of them, Celeste knew, were bricks in the foundation she was building now. One evening, as she adjusted a collage of maternal portraits taped to the wall, Daniel walked in with 2 glasses of sparkling cider. "You're smiling again," he said. "I never stopped," she replied, turning toward him. "I just forgot how it felt." He raised a brow. "That was poetic." "I'm nesting," she said, mock serious. "It brings out the poet in me." He laughed, soft, full-bodied, and leaned in to kiss her cheek. "Come with me," he said. She let him guide her upstairs, hand in hand, to the rooftop garden he had been quietly restoring for months. There, beneath strings of glowing bulbs and potted herbs swaying in the breeze, stood a narrow hand-carved bench, etched into its wood. Julian and Maeve's garden, planted with love. Celeste's breath hitched. "You did this," she whispered. "For them." "For you," Daniel said. "Every legacy begins with a seed." She lowered herself carefully onto the bench, emotion caught in her throat. "I used to think legacy meant institutions, scholarships, buildings with names on them." "It can," he said, "but it can also mean lullabies, dinner tables, a garden where your children learn the scent of basil and rain." They sat there hand in hand, watching the city shimmer below. That weekend they held a quiet dinner at home. No fanfare, just close friends' laughter and the smell of roasted rosemary chicken wafting through the house. Celeste wore a soft blue wrap dress, her baby bump leading the way, her smile radiant. At the table were women from every chapter of her life. A colleague from the museum, a nurse from the clinic, her childhood piano teacher, Daniel's cousin from New Orleans who insisted on bringing homemade beignets. They toasted to love, to resilience, to babies who better like jazz and history. Later that night, as Celeste washed dishes, slowly ignoring Daniel's protests, she paused by the window and watched as the lights of D.C. flickered on. She had once walked this city like a ghost. Now she walked it like a woman who knew where she was going. In bed that night, Daniel curled around her, hand resting gently on her belly. "They kick," she murmured. "Jealous," he whispered. "They get to hear your heartbeat from the inside." Celeste turned her head, forehead resting against his. "They'll hear yours too," she said, "in everything you do." He smiled against her skin. The house, once filled with echoes, now felt like it was brimming with dreams, with breath, with lives yet to arrive. They were building more than a family. They were building a new legacy, not one born from lineage or reputation, but from choice, from love, from a woman who had once been cast aside and a man who chose to walk beside her. Together, they were creating something no one could take away. Not time, not doubt, not even the past, Because this story, their story, was no longer about what they had lost. It was about what they had dared to believe in again, and what they would leave behind, not just names, but roots. Rain had fallen softly that morning, misting the windows and soaking the garden with a hushed, silvery sheen. But by afternoon the clouds lifted, as if called back to the heavens, and sunlight poured across the slate rooftops of Georgetown like a benediction. In the courtyard below, everything glistened rose petals on white linen candles, flickering in glass orbs, ivy-wrapped trellises that framed a single unadorned arch. Celeste stood inside the old stone house, one hand resting lightly on the windowsill, watching as guests arrived in quiet waves. Her dress was simple flowing ivory, not white, because this wasn't about beginnings in the traditional sense. It was about arrival, about choosing boldly, freely, and without apology what love meant when it was tested, earned, and still stood. She had never dreamed of weddings the way little girls were told to, but she had imagined this feeling, the stillness of certainty, the calm rush of being seen completely and cherished not in spite of her past but because of it. Behind her, soft laughter floated from the hallway as Daniel wrestled with his tie, muttering something about not trusting YouTube tutorials for formal wear. Her friend Imani peeked in. "You ready?" Celeste turned and her eyes shimmered. "I've been ready for years, I just didn't know it." The ceremony was private, only 20 guests beneath a canopy of spring blossoms and promise. There were no rows of chairs, no formal aisle, just a half circle of faces who had carried them through storms. Faces that had seen them separately break and slowly mend. Daniel stood at the arch already, a single dimple denting his cheek as she approached, led not by anyone but herself. She walked slowly, carefully, the twin heartbeats within her, like distant drums keeping time with her own. He met her in the middle. For a long moment neither spoke, because what could be said that hadn't already been lived? Still the efficient, a long-retired judge, and Daniel's family friends smiled and invited them to speak the words they had written. Daniel went first. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the note, then folded it back again. "No," he said softly, "I don't need the page." He looked at her, and the entire world fell away. "Celeste," he began, "when I first met you, I thought I was offering a home to someone who'd been cast out by the world. But the truth is, you were the home. You were the firelight in winter, the sound of music after silence, the proof that love doesn't arrive perfect, it arrives real. And I vow from this day forward to never let fear build walls between us. I will walk beside you, not ahead. I will listen before I speak. I will learn, unlearn, and relearn what it means to love you. Every day." Tears tracked silently down Celeste's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She wanted to feel every drop. Then she spoke. "Daniel," she began, her voice a velvet thread woven with strength. "There was a time I believed I had to shrink myself to be loved, to be quiet, to be grateful, to accept less than what my heart knew it needed. You never asked that of me. You stood back when I needed space. You stepped forward when I faltered. You let me return to myself before asking me to share anything. And so I vow to love you as you are, not for what you fix, but for how you stay. I vow to build with you, to bend, but not break, to meet you in the hard places and dance with you in the light." A wind moved gently through the courtyard as if blessing them. The officiant said the words. They kissed not with fireworks, but with reverence. And as the guests clapped, there was no fanfare, no orchestra, just the rustle of magnolia leaves and the sound of two hearts becoming one in the quietest, fiercest way. That evening they dined under the stars. String lights twinkled like earthbound constellations. Soft jazz curled from a vintage record player perched on the windowsill. Guests told stories, some sweet, some slightly embarrassing, and toasted to the power of choosing again, even after life has offered its worst. Celeste sat with Daniel at the long farmhouse table, their hands intertwined under the linen. She leaned in. "Do you think they know?" "Who?" he asked. "The twins. That they just got married with us." He laughed, resting a hand on her belly. "I think they felt every moment." Her eyes turned dreamy. "I hope they grow up knowing that love is like this. Not perfect, not loud, but steady, earned." Daniel looked at her, then his gaze soft and waited with emotion. They'll know, because they'll watch us. Later that night, long after the candles burned low and the laughter faded, Celeste stood at the bathroom mirror, brushing out her curls. Daniel came up behind her arm, slipping around her waist chin, resting on her shoulder. Their reflection was unremarkable. Two people in love, older than the fairy tales said they should be, but richer in something deeper. She turned to him, cradling his face. No regrets, she asked, teasing. He grew quiet, then said with gravity, only that we didn't find this sooner. She nodded. But if we had, maybe we wouldn't have been ready. He kissed her forehead. And for the first time in her life, Celeste felt it not as a gesture of affection, but as a vow. The truest one. The kind that isn't spoken once in ceremony, but lived out again and again in the quiet days that follow. In every touch, every decision, every moment where love asks, will you stay? And they answered together, yes. Snow had begun to fall outside the townhouse windows, soft drifting flakes that blanketed the city in a hush of peace. Inside, warmth glowed from every corner. A fire crackled low in the hearth. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla lingered in the air. A record spun in the background, playing Billie Holiday, her voice a velvet murmur in the stillness. Celeste sat in the rocking chair Daniel had refinished himself, oak smooth to satin with his own hands. In her arms, a blanket swaddled two tiny miracles. Julian was nestled on her chest, his breathing slow and rhythmic. Maeve curled beside him, her fingers gripping Celeste's shirt with surprising strength. She had imagined this moment so many times that it felt like déjà vu, and yet nothing could prepare her for the sheer aching beauty of it. She was a mother, not just in name but in soul. In the hush of midnight lullabies, in the fatigue that sweetened into awe, in the way her heart now beat in three places at once. Daniel appeared quietly in the doorway, holding a mug of warm tea. He paused, watching the scene before him with reverent stillness, as if afraid to disturb something holy. They're perfect, he said softly. Celeste smiled without looking up. They're ours. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on the edge of the blanket. Julian let out a tiny sigh, Maeve shifted, and Celeste kissed the crown of each head. You remember what you said, Daniel whispered. That love isn't perfect, it's earned. She nodded. He leaned in, brushing his lips to her cheek. You earned this, Celeste. Every heartbeat, every breath, every ounce of joy. Tears rose quiet and soft, not of sorrow, but of arrival. Because after all the years of silence, of judgment, of carrying the false name of barren, like a scar across her identity, this was the truth that remained. She was full of life, of love, of a legacy that no one could ever erase. Weeks passed and the house slowly found its rhythm. Feedings, diaper changes, laughter echoing against high ceilings. Friends dropped off casseroles and knitted blankets. The museum sent flowers. The board of Daniel's company offered paternity leave with no questions asked. But one letter stood out. A small envelope handwritten in blue ink. From a former intern of Celeste's, a young woman who had once stood in her office and confessed that she didn't believe women like her belonged in leadership, that she feared she'd have to choose between family and ambition. In her letter, she wrote, I saw the article about your twins. I watched your speech about motherhood, about second chances, and I cried, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. You changed the way I see myself. Celeste folded the letter and placed it in the keepsake box beside the crib. Love's truest victories were often quiet, often unseen, but they rippled. On the twins' first walk through the garden, bundled in scarves and joy, Daniel paused beneath the same ivy-covered arch where they had wed. Celeste looked at him, smiling. Still feels like a dream. It's not, he said. It's the life we chose. The wind stirred the branches above, and a few white petals floated down like snow. Celeste looked down at her children. They'll never know how hard it was to get here. Good, Daniel replied. They shouldn't. They'll just know they were wanted and loved. She slipped her hand into his. And in that quiet moment beneath a winter sky and a canopy of memory, they knew. Victory wasn't in headlines or vindication. It wasn't in proving anyone wrong. It was in choosing love again and again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. It was in the arms that held them when they fell. In the voices that whispered, you are enough. in the hearts that beat in harmony, despite the odds because of the odds. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the kind of love that grows even through the cracks, please like this video, leave us a comment with your favorite moment, and follow our channel for more soul-stirring stories. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we read in books or watch on screens. They're the ones we live. And love is the greatest story of all.